Pizza delivery guys. What's the strangest thing you've seen while delivering pizza? Answer 1. I've been working as a pizza delivery guy for several years now, and during that time I've seen a lot of strange things. But one incident stands out to me especially vividly. It was already late, somewhere around midnight, when I received an order for pizza delivery to an old, almost abandoned area of the city. The address looked suspicious, house number 13 on a street that wasn't even on the map. But work is work, and I went. When I finally found the house I was looking for, it looked like no one had left it for years. Peeling paint on the walls, an overgrown garden, broken windows. But the strangest thing began when I approached the door. From inside came quiet, strange sounds, like whispers. I knocked, and after a moment the door slowly opened by itself, as if the wind had pushed it, but there was no wind. It was dark inside, but I saw the faint light of candles flickering in the depths of the corridor. A man of about 50 appeared on the threshold, dressed in an old-fashioned suit, clearly not from this century. He looked as if he had stepped out of a photograph from the beginning of the last century. The man silently took the pizza, handed me an old, worn-out bill, and then simply disappeared into the darkness of the house. I stood in the doorway for a few more seconds trying to figure out what had just happened, but honestly, I was too scared to stay any longer. Since then, I have avoided this area, and even if there is an order there again, I will not take it. Answer 2. One day, I received an order to deliver pizza to a wealthy area of the city where the houses are one better than the other. It was an ordinary evening, and there were no signs of strangeness. The address pointed to a huge colonial mansion with a well-kept garden and high gates. When I approached the door, a man in a luxurious robe opened the door, but his gaze was somehow absent. He hardly looked at me, but kept looking back, as if he was afraid of something. When I went inside to deliver the pizza, it was a large order and the boxes needed to be placed on the table. I noticed that there was a strange atmosphere in the house. All the windows were covered with heavy curtains, and the rooms were lit only by candles, creating dark shadows on the walls. In the corner of the living room, I saw several people sitting in a circle on the floor. They were all dressed in white robes, and on their faces there were masks reminiscent of the faces of ancient gods or demons. I put the pizza on the table and was about to leave when the man suddenly put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Tonight is a special night. Would you like to join?" His voice was quiet but full of tension, as if he knew something I didn't. I quickly refused, took my money, and left as quickly as I could. When I went outside, I heard a strange hum behind me, as if the voices of dozens of people were coming from the house. I don't know what happened there, but I'm glad I left without finding out. Answer 3. The weirdest thing I've ever seen while working as a pizza delivery guy happened during one night shift. I received an order for delivery to a small apartment in the city center. The place was ordinary, nothing special, and I didn't expect to see anything unusual there. But when I arrived, I was greeted by a man dressed in a suit that would have been more suitable for the 19th century. He wore a top hat and carried a cane, and his manner was surprisingly old-fashioned. When I entered the apartment, I realized that the entire interior was in the style of that era: antique furniture and paintings, candelabra, and a huge fireplace. There were several other people in the room, dressed the same as the man who opened the door for me. They all looked like they were going to a party centuries ago. I was invited to put the pizza on the table, but no one present even looked at the food. They continued their conversations about something that seemed completely incomprehensible to me, as if I was in a different time period. As I left, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just witnessed some strange ritual or gathering that was best left unknown. I will never forget this order. Answer 4. Once I was delivering pizza to a house that was located on the outskirts of the city, almost right next to the forest. The road there was long and winding, and the further I drove, the less signs of civilization there were around. When I finally found the right house, it looked strange. An old, abandoned mansion standing alone in the middle of the forest. The door was opened by a middle-aged man dressed in simple clothes, but his gaze was somehow wild and unnatural. He invited me in, saying that I needed to wait until he brought the money. When I stepped inside, I felt the cold penetrate my bones. The inside of the house was empty. No furniture, no decor, only bare walls and an old, dusty floor. A few minutes later, the man returned, but instead of money, he was holding in his hands what looked like an ancient scroll. He handed it to me and said, "This knowledge is worth more than any pizza." I didn't know what to do, and feeling that the situation was becoming more and more frightening, I said that I would prefer money. The man looked at me for a long time, then shrugged his shoulders and went for real money. After this incident, I thought for a long time about what was really happening in this house. Never before and never since have I encountered anything like this. Answer 5. There was a time when I was delivering pizza to an ordinary-looking apartment in an apartment building. But when I approached the door, I was greeted by a strange smell that immediately alerted me. The door was opened by a young guy who looked rather nervous. He told me to wait and disappeared into the depths of the apartment. While I was waiting, I heard some noise coming from another room. The sound was strange, like someone was rustling, but I couldn't figure out what it was. A minute later, the guy returned, but instead of taking the pizza, he asked, "Are you by any chance afraid of snakes?" I didn't know what to answer and asked why he was asking this. He just shrugged and pointed to the room where the noise was coming from. "My python is there, she's hungry," he said. I decided not to ask whether the snake was hungry enough to want to eat more than pizza. I just gave the order and left, trying not to show that I was really a little scared by this situation. Answer 6. I once delivered pizza to a country house, which turned out to be a real estate with huge gates and a long driveway. While I was driving to the house, not a soul was visible around, only the fog that enveloped the entire area. When I arrived at the house, the door was opened by a man in a black suit and with a black mask on his face. He looked as if he had just returned from some kind of masquerade, but his eyes were completely serious. He invited me in to pick up the pizza and pay for my order. I stepped inside and immediately felt cold goosebumps run through my skin. There was dead silence in the house, but there was a strange tension in the air, as if something terrible had just happened here. The man disappeared into one of the rooms and returned with money, which he gave to me without a word. I didn't ask any questions and left the place as quickly as possible. The next day I heard that something strange had happened in that house the day before, and since then I've been trying to avoid the area. Answer 7. There was an occasion when I delivered pizza to a party in a large country house. It was somewhere after midnight, and when I arrived, the music was blaring so loud that it seemed like the walls of the house were vibrating. I walked up to the door and it was opened by a man who had clearly already had a lot of fun. He was wearing a strange costume that resembled some kind of ancient god or demon. The face was painted, and on the head was a huge headdress with horns. He shouted something deeper into the house, and soon several more people dressed in similar costumes approached the door. They invited me inside to take the pizza to the kitchen, and I might not have done it if it weren't for the noise and laughter coming from all the rooms. I stepped inside and immediately realized that I was in some kind of extremely strange party. All the furniture was pushed against the walls, and a huge pentagram was painted on the floor in the center of the living room. Around him danced people in masks and robes, some of whom were holding candles. As I placed the pizza on the kitchen table, one of the guests approached me and told me that I had arrived just in time for the climax of the ritual. I smiled and said it was time for my next order. Luckily, they didn't insist and I was able to leave quickly. But on the way home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just attended a meeting of some cult or something like that. I remembered this night for the rest of my life, and since then I always double-check where I need to deliver the pizza. Answer 8. There was one incident that I remember with a shudder every time I tell my friends about my work. It happened late at night in the old part of the city. I received an order for delivery to a multi-story building that looked like something out of a horror movie. Old, dilapidated, with broken windows and an overgrown area. I drove up to the entrance and noticed that not a single light was on there, except for one dim lantern, which illuminated only a small part of the yard. When I went up to the right floor and knocked on the door, an old man opened the door, looking as if he had not left this house for several decades. His skin was pale, his hair was gray, and his eyes looked through me, as if he saw something that was unknown to me. He took the pizza and invited me in to change money, saying that it was dark in the corridor and it was inconvenient for him to count. I entered the apartment. and the first thing that caught my eye was the terrible smell of dampness and mold. The room was filled with old furniture covered in a thick layer of dust, and on the walls hung portraits of people who, apparently, had lived in the last century. The old man brought the money, and I noticed that it was too old to be real. The bills looked as if they had not been used for many years. When I was about to leave, the old man suddenly said, "Do you know that this is the last dinner in this house?" I didn't understand what he meant, but I hurried away, feeling a strange feeling of anxiety. The next day, when I drove past this house, I noticed that the apartment to which I delivered pizza was completely empty, as if no one had lived there for many years. I was never able to understand what happened that night, but since then, I always feel a chill whenever I pass by this place. Answer 9. One day I received an order to deliver pizza to a house that was located in a rural area, quite far from the city. It was during the day and I wasn't expecting anything unusual, but as I got closer to the indicated address, the road became increasingly narrow and neglected. Finally, I arrived at an old wooden house that looked like no one had lived in it for many years. But the strangest thing began when I got out of the car. I heard strange sounds coming from somewhere in the forest, like animal cries or something similar. But I decided not to pay attention to it and went to the door. When I knocked, the door was opened by a middle-aged woman with long, disheveled hair and a blank stare. She silently took the pizza and without saying a word went deeper into the house, leaving the door open. I decided to wait, but after a few minutes I realized that she was not going to come back to pay. I looked inside and saw that the house was practically empty, only an old table and a few chairs, and in the corner of the room there was a large bag from which some sounds were coming. I quickly backed down and decided to leave without waiting for payment. When I returned to the base and told my colleagues, they advised me not to accept any more orders in that direction. Who knows what happened there? But I'm glad I didn't stay to find out. Answer 10. There was one incident that I will never forget. I was working at night and received an order to deliver pizza to a private house on the outskirts of the city. The house looked ordinary, but it was dark and quiet, as if the whole world had stood still. I went to the door and no one answered my knocks. I was about to leave when the door slowly opened on its own. It was dark inside and only a faint light fell on the floor from the depths of the corridor. I called, but no one answered. Deciding that this was some kind of joke, I still went inside, leaving the pizza on the table in the hallway. But when I turned to leave, I heard a quiet whisper coming from the next room. I couldn't make out the words, but it was definitely a voice, and it was calling my name. My heart began to pound, and I rushed to the exit, forgetting about everything in the world. Just leaving the house, I turned around and saw that the door that I had left open was now tightly closed. Since then, I have never taken a night shift assignment again, especially in this area. Answer 11. One day I received a rather unusual order. I had to deliver pizza to a house that was located on the very edge of the city, almost in the forest. When I arrived, I felt like I was on the set of a horror movie. The house was huge, old, and looked as if people had abandoned it long ago. Everything was overgrown, and the only source of light came from the porch light, which flickered like in the movies. When I knocked on the door, a middle-aged man with a wild look opened the door, as if he had not seen people for years. He was wearing old clothes and his hands were shaking. He invited me to come in so I could take the pizza to the kitchen, which in itself was strange enough. But what also alarmed me was that there was no furniture in the house, only a table and one chair in the center of the room. While I was putting the pizza on the table, the man suddenly said, "You know, there used to be an orphanage here. Nobody likes to remember what happened here." He looked at me as if he expected me to know about something terrible, what happened in this house. I, of course, didn't know anything and didn't want to know, so I simply wished him bon appetit and left the house as quickly as possible. As I was walking out the door, I heard him laughing quietly, and that sound still sometimes pops up in my head. Answer 12. This incident happened a couple of years ago when I had just started working as a delivery driver. I received an order to deliver pizza to a remote country house which was located far outside the city, almost in the forest. When I arrived, the house looked rather ominous, old, with peeling paint and overgrown bushes. There was complete silence around. Only the wind rustled in the tree branches. When I went to the door and knocked, no one answered for me for a long time. I was about to leave, but suddenly the door suddenly swung open, and a woman stood on the threshold with a distorted expression on her face. She looked very worried and asked if I had seen anyone on the way here. I said I didn't see anyone, and then she hurriedly took the pizza and disappeared into the back of the house, leaving the door ajar. I was about to leave, but something made me look back at the house. In the second-floor window, I saw the figure of a man standing in the dark. He didn't move, just looked straight at me. I was overcome with horror and rushed to the car, feeling my heart pounding in my chest. When I returned to the base, I told my colleagues about this incident, but no one believed me. They said that it was probably a figment of my imagination. But I'm sure it wasn't just fear. I still remember that look from the window. Answer 13. One day I was delivering pizza to an apartment on the top floor of an old apartment building. As I walked up the stairs, I noticed that the building was in poor condition, cracked walls, dim lighting, and creaking steps. When I reached the right door and knocked, a man who looked as if he had not been outside for many years opened the door. His clothes were dirty and his hair was disheveled. He invited me in to put the pizza on the table, and I stepped inside. The room was full of strange objects, old books, antiques, and some strange artifacts. There were portraits on the walls of people who looked like they were from another era, and they all seemed to be watching me with their eyes. The man said that he would bring the money now and went into another room, leaving me alone. Suddenly I felt a cold wind, although the windows were closed. I looked back and saw one of the paintings slowly turning on the wall, as if someone was moving it from the other side. I froze, and then, gathering all my courage, I walked up to the painting, but behind it, there was nothing but a wall. The man came back, gave me money, and said that no one delivers pizza to him anymore because they are afraid of his collection. I did not clarify what he meant and hurried away. Since then, I have avoided delivering pizza to this area because I still can't forget that feeling of being cold and being watched. Answer 14. One day I received an order to deliver pizza to a small, rundown hotel on the outskirts of town. I pulled up and immediately noticed that the place looked pretty bleak, peeling paint, broken windows, and an empty parking lot. But the strangest thing happened when I approached the door of the room where I needed to deliver the order. When I knocked, the door opened slightly and I saw an old man sitting on the bed, dressed in an old military uniform. He looked at me with a kind of absent look, as if he didn't realize I was there. I asked if he actually ordered pizza, but he didn't answer, just pointed to the chair next to the bed. I put the pizza on the chair and was about to leave when the old man suddenly said, "Today is the anniversary. Everyone will be back, like every year." I didn't understand what he was talking about, but decided not to ask any more questions. Already at the exit from the hotel, I felt like I was being watched. When I turned around, I saw that in the window of the room where the old man was, there were several people in military uniforms who were not there when I entered. They looked at me and I felt a shiver run down my spine. I hurried to leave, and since then I have been trying to avoid deliveries to this hotel. Answer 15. One day I received an order to deliver pizza to a private home in a fairly quiet area. When I arrived, the house looked ordinary, nothing out of the ordinary, but when I approached the door, the street suddenly became very quiet, as if the whole world had stopped. I knocked on the door and a middle-aged woman with a friendly smile answered. She invited me in and said that she would bring the money now. I walked into the house and noticed that everything in it looked old-fashioned, as if time had stopped 20 years ago. But the strangest thing was that there were photographs of the same family on the walls, but in each photograph the faces of the people were crossed out with black paint, all except one, the face of a young girl. The woman returned with the money, and I couldn't resist asking, "Who is that in the photographs?" She replied, "This is my family. We lost them many years ago, but they are still here, watching over us." Her words were spoken with such confidence that I felt uneasy. I accepted the money and hurried away, trying not to look back. This incident left me with the feeling that I had just encountered something inexplicable. Answer 16. There was one incident that I remember with slight horror. I received an order to deliver pizza to a house in the suburbs that looked quite respectable. When I arrived, it was already dark outside, and the only light came from the lantern at the gate. I walked up to the door and a man in a robe opened the door. He looked quite relaxed and smiled welcomingly. He invited me in so that I wouldn't stand in the cold while he found the money. I entered the house and immediately noticed that the interior was unusual. On the walls hung masks similar to those worn in carnivals, and in the corner of the room stood a large mannequin dressed in period clothing. The room smelled of something sweet but unpleasant. The man left for a few minutes, leaving me alone, and suddenly I heard a whisper. I looked around, but there was no one there. The whisper became louder, and it seemed to me that it was coming from a mannequin. I walked closer and saw that his eyes seemed to be following me. At that moment the man returned and, seeing me at the mannequin, said, "Do you like him? This is my little collection. Every time someone comes to the house, he learns something new." I hurried to take the money and leave, feeling my heart pounding with fear. Since then, I have always tried to stay away from such houses where the collections seem too alive. Answer 17. One day I received an order to deliver pizza to a house that was located in a rather remote area surrounded by forest. The house was old and looked abandoned, but the lights were on in the windows. When I approached the door, an old man opened the door, looking as if he had not seen guests for many years. His clothes were threadbare and his eyes were deeply sunken. He invited me in to leave the pizza on the table, and when I stepped inside, a strange feeling came over me. There was no furniture in the room, just old photographs on the walls, each of them in a frame that looked like it was handmade. An old man came up to me and asked, "Do you know why no one delivers pizza here?" I froze in place, not knowing what to answer. He continued, "They're all gone, but they'll come back and you'll see them too." I did not specify who he meant and hurried away, feeling a shiver run through me. When I was leaving, I looked back and saw the old man looking at me through the window, and his gaze was so strange that I could not forget that night for a long time. Answer 18. Once I delivered pizza to a house that was located on the very outskirts of the city, where the forest almost began. The place was quite secluded, and when I arrived, I felt a little uneasy. The house looked old, but well maintained, and there was a light on the porch. I went to the door and knocked, but no one opened. I knocked again, and suddenly the door slowly opened on its own. It was dark inside, and only the dim light of the lamp illuminated part of the hallway. I called the owners, but no one answered. As I was about to leave, I heard someone whispering my name. I froze in place, trying not to panic, and suddenly I saw a woman coming out of the darkness. She looked like a ghost, pale skin, long black hair, and eyes that seemed like black holes. She came up to me and said quietly, "They want you to stay, forever." I threw the pizza on the floor and ran out of the house, feeling terrified. I never returned for the money and never took orders to that area again. Answer 19. One day I was delivering pizza to a house that was practically hidden deep in the forest. The road there was long and confusing, and when I finally found the right house, it looked like an abandoned hut. Only the light in the window indicated that someone was there. I went to the door and knocked, and a man who looked like a hunter opened it. A beard, rough clothes, and he was holding a hunting knife in his hands. He invited me in and said that he would bring me money now. I stepped inside and immediately felt the cold penetrate my bones. The house was dark. Only a weak fire was burning in the fireplace in the corner. Trophies hung on the walls, animal heads, stuffed birds, and old guns. The man went into another room, and I noticed that in the corner there was a large, locked chest. I didn't want to stay there any longer than necessary, but the man didn't return for a long time. Suddenly I heard a quiet creak, as if someone was opening a chest. I looked back and saw that the lock on the chest was broken, and the lid was slowly being lifted. Without waiting to see what would happen next, I jumped out of the house and ran to the car. I was no longer interested in money. I just wanted to leave as quickly as possible. I never went to this area again. Answer 20. One day I received an order to deliver pizza to a house that was located in the suburbs, in a fairly quiet area. When I arrived, the house looked ordinary, but when I approached the door, I heard strange sounds inside, like growls. I knocked, and a moment later the door was opened by a man covered in dirt, with a wild look in his eyes. He grabbed the pizza from my hands and closed the door without saying a word. I was about to leave when I suddenly heard a loud crash and screams from inside. I panicked, but decided to check if everything was okay and knocked again. This time the door was opened by the same man, but his look was completely different, calm, as if nothing had happened. He apologized for the delay and gave me the money before slowly closing the door. I didn't know what to think, but as I was leaving, in the window I saw a strange shadow that flashed and disappeared. I never delivered pizza to that house again, and I always feel uneasy when I remember that incident. Answer 21. One day I was delivering pizza to a small house on the outskirts of the city. It was a normal evening, and I didn't expect anything strange. As I approached the door, an older man who looked friendly and smiled opened the door, inviting me in. The house was warm and cozy, with a fire burning in the fireplace. He asked me to go to the kitchen, where he was going to leave the money on the table. While he was looking for money, I noticed photographs of different people on the walls. One of the photographs showed a large family smiling around a holiday table. But when I looked closer, I realized that all the other photographs were of the same faces, but with each new photo they became more and more gloomy and tired. In the last photo, all the faces were crossed out with crosses. The man noticed me looking at the photographs and said, "These are my favorites. They are always with me." His voice was quiet, almost a whisper. I accepted the money and hurried away, feeling a sense of anxiety growing inside me. When I left the house, I looked back and saw a man standing at the window, carefully watching me. I never returned to that area again. Answer 22. One night I received an order to deliver pizza to a rather upscale area. The house was huge, with a high fence and a well-kept garden. When I arrived, the gate automatically opened and I drove to the entrance. When I knocked on the door, a woman opened the door, dressed in a long evening dress with brightly painted eyes and lips. She looked strange, like she had too much makeup on. She invited me in, saying that the money was in the kitchen, and I followed her along the long corridor. The house was incredibly luxurious, but there was a strange feeling of emptiness in the air, as if no one lived here. There were paintings on the walls depicting dark scenes full of pain and fear. The kitchen was set for two, but no one else was in the house, at least apparently. The woman gave me money and suddenly asked, "Have you ever felt like you were being watched?" Her question took me by surprise, and I didn't know how to answer. She just smiled and said, "Don't worry, you're not the only one who feels this." I hurried away, feeling fear rising within me. When I turned around on the way out, I saw her looking at me through the window. Her smile was strange, almost creepy. I still can't get this order out of my head. Answer 23. One evening I received an order to deliver pizza to a house on the outskirts of the city. It was an old neighborhood where the houses were far apart and it was always quiet and a little creepy. When I arrived, the house looked old and abandoned, but there were lights in the windows and it seemed strange. When I knocked, a young woman with a worried expression opened the door. She looked like she was tormented by something, and without saying a word, she took the pizza and quickly closed the door. As I was leaving, I heard a loud scream from inside the house, which made me freeze in place. I turned around and saw a man running out of the house, clearly in a panic. He rushed towards me and grabbed my hand, begging for help. I didn't know what to do, but I instinctively wanted to help. He said something terrible was happening in the house and asked me to call the police. I quickly went to the car and dialed the number, but when I turned around, the man had already disappeared. I returned to base and later learned that something terrible had actually happened at this house several years ago, and it had been ignored ever since. This incident still haunts me, and I try not to go to those places. Answer 24. One day I was delivering pizza to an old high-rise building in the city center. When I arrived, the street was dark and deserted, and only rare passers-by were hurrying about their business. The house was in poor condition, and the inside smelled of dampness and old age. As I walked up the stairs, I noticed that there were locked doors on each floor, and only the last floor had a light on. I went to the right door and knocked. A few moments later, an old man who looked very strange opened the door. His skin was pale and his eyes seemed to glow in the dark. He invited me in to put the pizza on the table. It was dark and cold inside, like an abandoned house, and I noticed that all the windows were boarded up and the walls were decorated with old photographs. The old man came up to me and said quietly, "Do you know that this house is the only thing that keeps us here?" I didn't know what he meant, but I decided not to ask questions. As I was leaving, I heard him say, "Soon there will be more of us. We are waiting for you." I left the house and felt fear growing inside me. It was one of the creepiest feelings I've ever experienced at work. Answer 25. One day I received an order to deliver pizza to a small house on the outskirts of the city. When I arrived, the house looked old, but well maintained, with a large garden around it. When I approached the door, an older man opened the door, dressed in old clothes that seemed out of place for this time. He invited me in, and I noticed that the inside of the house was furnished with antique furniture, and there were antique clocks hanging on the walls. The man asked me to wait while he brought the money, and I, left alone, began to look around. On the table lay an old newspaper with headlines about some event that happened many years ago. When the man returned, he looked at me with a sad expression and said, "You weren't supposed to see that." I didn't understand what he was talking about, but I felt that I needed to leave. When I went outside, I noticed that the clock that was hanging on the wall showed the same time, as if it had stopped. The next day I told my colleagues about the strange incident, but they just laughed and said that it was a figment of my imagination. However, I still feel like there was something unusual going on in that house, and I'm glad I didn't go there again.